Dobro večer svima, dobrodošli na Institut za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju. Hvala vam što ste se pojavili u ovolikom broju. Moje ime je Stefan Gužvica, ja sam istraživač pripravnik i bit ću moderator današnjeg razgovora o knjizi. Radni jezik je pre svega engleski, ali slobodno postavljajte pitanja i na srpsko-hrvatskom. Pol isto rado može odgovarati na oba jezika, kao i svi drugi panelisti.
Misliš na srpskom i na hrvatskom? Misliš na srpskom?
Da, i na srpskom i na gorskom i tako dalje. Da. But yeah, so now I will switch to English for that exact purpose. So welcome. My name is Stefan Gužvica. I am a junior researcher here at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and I'll be the moderator of today's book talk. As I said, you can ask questions in Serbo-Croatian, but I guess if you need English, that part is not too relevant for you anyway. And today we will be discussing the book by Paul Stubbs called Socialist Yugoslavia and the Non-Aligned Movement, Social, Cultural, Political, and Economic Imaginaries. Or should I say not by Paul Stubbs, but edited by Paul Stubbs, who also wrote the introduction to the book. And it's an interesting, groundbreaking work, which is essentially looking at the history of the non-aligned movement, both from above, but from below as well. So not merely as a top-down project of cooperation between states, but as many other various layers of, grassroots initiatives, cultural collaborations, economic cooperation, and so on. And Paul will begin with a sort of a brief overview of how this work came into being and what it's all about. He is a sociologist and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Economics in Zagreb, in Croatia. As I said, the editor of the book and the author of the introduction. And his research interests are global social policy, policy translation, the new left-green urban political movements, and issues of poverty and social exclusion. And he's currently working on new research on a history of the new international economic order. So, Paul, go ahead.
Oh, okay, we're doing one by one, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
thanks, Stefan.
So people remember.
Thanks for the invitation to do this. I'm going to make sure that I don't speak more than about 12 minutes. This is behind me, so I'm going to say two things that I've learned from editing this, which are perhaps not the best things, because the rest of it has been probably one of the most positive experiences of my life. The first thing I learned is never put a map on the cover of a book, right? It's a long story how we got to this map. You should have seen some earlier versions that the publisher suggested, but we were locked into it. And immediately it came out, a friend of mine, and she is still a friend, sent a map of the French Empire, which had the same thing, where Yugoslavia is now there, France was there with all the lines emanating from France. So, there's a bit of a problem with the map. The second thing, and I was just discussing this with Nemanja earlier, when social scientists and historians work together, it's best to follow the way of referencing of historians. If you don't do that, it's probably best to follow the way of... Okay, my voice is so loud from Liverpool that you don't need this. If you don't do that, it's probably best to follow the mode of referencing of social scientists. What you shouldn't do is what I tried to do, which was merge the two together. And we thought we got away with the idea that we would have in text, in brackets, kind of references to books, but archival material could be in footnotes. And somebody in McGill, Queens, who understands the Chicago way of doing references better than I do, told us you couldn't do that, so we had to change all the archival footnotes into in-text citations, and it looks horrible. And anyway, historians make up all those archival things anyway. So it doesn't matter. Look, Nemanja is here because it is a program of decentralized cooperation. We had a book launch in Zagreb, and so Tvrtko Jakovina and Liliana Kolesnik, the Zagreb authors, were there with me. We had one in London, and Dubravka Sekulic and Peter Willits were there. In Belgrade, I guess it should have been you and Ivica Mladenovic. Ivica's in Paris, so he's not here. But I do want to just shout out to all of the authors, really, in the order of the book. Chiara Bonfiglioli, Peter Willits, Gal Kian, Tvojko Jakovina, Bojana Videkanic, Bojana Piško and Georgia Balmazovic, Liliana Kolesnik, Mila Turalic, Jure Ramšak, Dubravka Sekulic, Augustin Kosovski, Nemanja Radonjic, Leonora Dugonic Rodwin, Ivica Mladenovic, David Hennig, and Maple Raza. That's the book. All right. And I want to say something about the timeline just because, and Yelena was a big part of this. 3 years ago, from February until April 2020, I was supposed to be on a fellowship which involved being in an Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. And on, I think, was it 26th and 27th of March, or the 27th and 28th? There should have been a workshop funded by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, in which many of the people who later became authors of this book would have had an initial conference. We all know why that didn't happen. We ended up with a 4-day online event about a year later, also funded by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And if you're here, thank you. And by then, we actually knew who the authors were going to be. We didn't have book chapters, but we knew who the authors were going to be. And people submitted by May 2021. We then got reviews, as usual, and it was resubmitted in December 2021 and published a year later. It actually says 2023 on the cover, but I think most of us got physically in our hands in December 2022. So it didn't take long. And I really, I think editing books is a weird thing because you're as fast as the slowest person who meets deadlines, but everyone was brilliant at meeting deadlines. Actually, the trick is to tell them a month earlier that there is no more time, and then you kind of, anyway. It's a bit of a joke. It's true. I think I've now realized that in the book, there are some principles which everyone adheres to. Actually, one principle everyone adheres to because it's not hard to adhere to it, but we'll come on to that in a minute. The first is the book is an attempt to go beyond amnesia, but not to be nostalgic. All right? In my brief time in the Socialist Workers' Party, there was this T-shirt, neither Washington nor Moscow. I want a new T-shirt which says neither amnesia nor nostalgia. But the amnesia, perhaps it's not even amnesia. It is a structured violence of forgetting the Socialist Yugoslav period, yes? I live in a country in which you're not allowed on public television to use the word Yugoslavia. When there is the celebration of an anniversary of a basketball victory in the Olympic Games, you talk about bivsha reprezentacija, right? So it was about stopping that amnesia. But it was not about nostalgia. The book is very much about the contradictions and complexities and the impossibility of a single linear deterministic approach to the question of socialist Yugoslavia and then on, right? And so the second principle is very much the Chairman Mao one of let 1,000 flowers bloom. Stefan hinted at it. Diverse approaches, multi-disciplinary. Many of us think we're post-disciplinary or ill-disciplined. The positive encouragement of different styles and genres of writing, some traditional academic texts, but a graphic novel in the middle, with lots of pictures in it. Mila Toralic's stills of things that she found in the archive of the Yugoslav news agency. Different themes, but also different conclusions. That there are actually deliberately unresolved arguments in the book about how we might consider things. I'll take two just at random. One is the relationship between Bandung and Belgrade. The Bandung 55, Belgrade 61. We've got everything except, thank God, the kind of lazy scholarship which says the non-aligned movement started in Bandung in 1955, right? We don't have that. But the connections, the links between the two, whether they're completely separate, is there. And then we've got arguments amongst art historians. And the arguments are actually about whether non-aligned art, what kind of relationship with Eurocentric modernity, artistic modernism it had, right? And this might sound esoteric, but they're really important arguments, but they should not be resolved in a book like this. They should run and run and run and be argued about in the future. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there actually, because there's some other things. I wrote something after this, which was a kind of auto-critique of the Yugocentrism of the book, right? That ideally the next book should not be about Yugoslavia. It should be about different nodes of the non-aligned movement, right? That came out a long time before the book came out. But in a sense, the book is a deliberate attempt to actually say, we need research which doesn't just say, as long as you've got a European Erasmus grant and you compare this space with Austria, Italy, and Germany, you're doing the right thing. Let's actually kind of think about the world as the world. So there's that. But I do want to say something about what I think. No, absolutely not. Although the pictures are nice, aren't they? Yeah. But yeah. I do think that in my introduction, I reached some kind of provisional understanding of the question, really. And of course, the provisional understanding is that you have to do deep conjunctural analysis, right? So Gramsci, Stuart Hall get mobilized here, because you cannot generalize about the relationship with Socialist Yugoslavia and the non-aligned movement outside of particular conjunctures, right? But I think I've made 3 provisional conclusions, which need more work on, and I'll talk about that at the end of this. The first is that, of course, it's deeply contradictory. You can find Socialist Yugoslavia as a brilliant example of what I would call a node of decolonial affinity. Socialist Yugoslavia offered real, material, and important support to decolonial movements, including liberation struggles and including armed struggles, right? Go to the Museum of African Art and see the exhibition on the links with the Algerian resistance movement. But you also have pragmatic instrumentalism, of course. It's a nation state, right? It was isolated because of the historical no with Stalin. It couldn't find a Balkan federation. It had to find new partners. It found new partners, but part of those partnerships were about trade. Part of those were about arms trade. And actually Indonesia, when Sukarno was overthrown by probably the most brutal right-wing dictatorship, the Yugoslavs wait a while to meet the new Indonesian government. But the first question they ask is, I assume our arms sales are still okay, right? So that mixture, the impossibility of actually coming down on the side of it was all about decolonial idealistic affinity, or it was all about pragmatic institutional instrumentalism, is really important. The second, and I'm a sociologist, so I do this, it's part of what I do for a living. I put together 2 words that cannot be put together and think I've come up with something that might be interesting. And the phrase I came up with was liminal hegemony, right? Yugoslavia's involvement with the non-aligned movement was as a liminal hegemon. It was hegemonic in the 60s. Not only did the Yugoslavs pay for a lot of the summit meetings, they wrote the final communiques before the summits actually happened. They were very much concerned with the image of the movement and the way in which summits should be held. But they were also aware of their own liminality, which was, we're not really a decolonial state, although there might be people who want to argue about that. And we're certainly not in the global south, right? You know, you've got at one moment, what's his name, Supek. We are one of the more developed of the less developed countries. You know, so this kind of, you know, how we do this. And, you know, having privatized the movement in the 1960s, the Yugoslavs were incredibly upset when the Algerians privatized the movement in 1973. actually. So, liminal hegemony. And the third, and this came, Budimir Lončar was, I'm very pleased to say, present and spoke at the launch in Zagreb. But when I sat down with Budimir, probably for the first or second time, he talked about de-ideologization, de-ideologization. Every summit had to do two things, right? Before the summit, you get all of the participants together so that none of the disputes between participating member states would come up during the summit. We'll keep them separate. But also, we want to criticize both the Americans and the Soviets, and we don't want to seem like the Cubans would have liked to just be criticizing one side. So this kind of let's keep ideology out of it meant, in my view, the marginalizing of radical alternatives, right? Whether that was CONAFO from the Indonesians or the Tricontinental from the Cubans, right? Now, okay, you could argue that the Yugoslav revolution ran out of steam in 1968 or 1969 or 1970, but you can see that mirrored in the way the Yugoslavs are approaching the non-aligned movement. And that's it, except I wanted in the last minute to say what I'm working on after the book. I'm probably not going to edit another book, I'm going to write my own. And probably it's going to be on the new international economic order, because the Yugoslavs didn't lead it, and yet Yugoslav economists were really important. And the triangle between the non-aligned movement, the G77 and UNCTAD seems to me to be like incredibly important. And it went for a long time. I'm also working on trying to break down the distinction between the internal and the external, right? So this idea that the North-South divide of inequality was also mirrored in Yugoslavia itself, between the North, the rich North, and the poorer South. I'm also trying to do stuff that breaks down this idea of top-down versus bottom-up. I want to write a text which is about the racialized ordering of Yugoslavia's understandings, which I'm calling a deracialized anti-racism. Just throwing these out so you can ask questions about them. I do also want to write the article which starts with why was Praxis only reading German philosophy, and why did they not read Fanon and Pan-Africanism and the Eurocentrism of oppositional knowledge circulation. And the last thing I want to work on is actually kind of provincializing the turn to Europe, because it's not as simple as Tito dies and Yugoslavia sees its future in Europe. Yugoslavia wanted to kind of make the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe a bit more like the non-aligned movement, in which colonial European nation states would understand that colonialism was a problem. So I want to stop there. That was 15 and a half minutes instead of 13. I'm sorry, but yeah, it's great to be here, and it's great to be able to do this and to see the book existing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was wonderful, and no need to apologize for the time. We're counting with that as a contingency, and I think there'll be plenty of really interesting questions afterwards. But now we will move on to Nemanja Radonjic, who is an assistant professor, the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Belgrade, and a research associate at the Institute for Recent History of Serbia. So his main research interests are non-alignment, anti-colonialism, and the social history of Yugoslavia, as well as the relations between Socialist Yugoslavia and African anti-colonial movements and post-colonial states. And he is an... I guess... Yeah. Shouldn't have people working, but anyway. Nemanja is an author of a chapter titled A Non-Aligned Continent, Africa in the Global Imaginary of Socialist Yugoslavia. So, Nemanja, please go ahead. Hopefully not get interrupted.
And it's great to be here in this lovely space of your institute. Forgive my post-COVID voice, but I'm really happy for the book to finally be out, finally in the sense of not taking too long, but finally in the sense I think Paul was too modest in several ways. So if you were the bad cop towards the book you edited, I will be the good cop who would say a couple of really good things here. One good thing is actually Paul gathering us, a dozen of us, I think, a lot of us, of a lot of different authors, so social scientists, historians, but also what I think is also important, artists and performers who basically dealt with non-alignment and I would say touched upon non-alignment more than dealt with non-alignment, because bar Peter Willits, who is a veteran historian of non-alignment, many of us actually dealt with non-alignment in a alternative, I want to say, way. I think Paul noticed this and gathered us first in this workshop that didn't happen, but then in the workshop that did happen, and it was just a flow of ideas, and all the talks we had on the margins of various conferences and over various drinks were suddenly flowing towards something that would become actually this book. What I think is most important here is actually the different views presented here. So not necessarily conflicting views, but different views from different angles, and from different angles I also want to say geographically, of course, taking note of Paul's Eurocentrism remark, with which I of course agree, but many of us who dealt with Yugoslav sources, be it historians or other scientists, felt this kind of need to expand, but we also felt the need to avoid this amnesia. So when I was doing my PhD, beginning my PhD in 2015, dealing with the image of Africa in Yugoslavia, there were much less authors ready to discuss this topic, and I had to actually rely on authors who dealt with non-alignment and Yugoslav ties with the post-colonial world in the 80s. Some are still alive, some went back to these topics, and the veterans of this institutionalized but also deinstitutionalized cooperation, such as Budimir Lončar or Biserka Cvjetičanin in Zagreb, the first and only director of Udruženje Jugoslovenskih Afrikanista. These were all like snippets of history that were, as Paul said, prone to amnesia, and that were maybe not attacked as demonically in the Serbian, Croatian public as part of Yugo nostalgia, because they were not as prominent as some other parts of Yugoslav heritage, such as socialism. But they were threatened to be forgotten. And what I think is also the second point I would like to put out here is that people who are authors in this book, such as Tvrtko Jakovina, Mila Turajlić, Jure Ramšak, Avgustin Kosovski, and others who Paul mentioned, approached this topic without nostalgia, I think, and with many questions about Yugoslav pragmatism. And from my own experience, this is one of the first paradoxes that you meet with these high horse Yugoslav slogans of anti-colonial solidarity and anti-capitalist solidarity, but then you have the stuff that goes on na terenu, where you have cooperation, as my colleague Jure Ramšak noted, with American, French companies, and even some neo-colonial practices. These were sources that were not omitted in the book, but which were questioned and put onto questioning. The second thing is, this is something in totally in line with my own work on Yugoslavia and Africa, is actually decentering it in the sense of Yugoslavia itself. Because if we are to respect the form of the country itself as a decentralized country, we must investigate not only Tito's trips to Africa, but also how various folklore societies went to Africa. Because they're coming directly from the sources. You have Yugoslav officials saying to kulturno-umetnička društva, you are the representatives of the new Yugoslavia, so you manage this foreign policy. And this is something that was very interesting to me, as are many actors which were also omitted from these grand histories, even during the existence of Yugoslavia itself, and many of my colleagues, such as Mila Turajlić and her work on Stevan Labudović, put light on these actors who are treated as minor historical actors until now, and who are now giving us, I think, unparalleled view at Yugoslav non-alignment, which was, I argue, a doctrine that went through society much more, and that was much more pervasive. I sometimes argue even more than socialism, because it was at times, even in Yugoslavia itself, to piggyback on your discussion with Lonchar, de-ideologized, because even now in Yugo-nostalgia, you have RTS and other media here who want to make some kind of nostalgic documentaries about Yugoslavia, and they first come to this global Yugoslavia, Energoprojekt. We were successful in Africa. We built this, we built that. Yes, but under what conditions? This is not explored. And this is something that drew me to cooperating with this awesome team of people which dealt with other geographical areas. I had experience with Yugoslavia and Africa, but it was important to me to see, for example, my colleague Augustin, who was the first, I think, who dealt with Chilean or Peruvian or Colombian sources, Argentinian sources in South America, where we have reflections actually of Yugoslav non-aligned politics, and we can view Yugoslavia in the historical context of the Cold War, but also post-colonial world and anti-capitalist world. So this is a couple of points I wanted to make here, and I would be glad if there were some interesting questions that would actually make this discussion lively as other discussions were. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Nemanja. If I may note just very briefly on memory, I mean, there is another side of that as well, which, for instance, in Croatian public discourse, if it appears, the Index, for instance, several times wrote about, yeah, well, you know, this non-aligned movement, look at Tito hanging out with all these dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko, you know, and completely decontextualizing. Again, this is pointing out an interesting contradiction, of course, because you start in 61 with the minute of silence for Lumumba and all that, right? But at the same time, you know, Index is like the great defender of liberal values in Croatia does not really discuss, you know, how did this Mobutu Sese Seko guy come to power in the first place and what is happening there, right? So,
and it doesn't discuss, just to a short commentary, it doesn't discuss, okay, Tito met with Mobutu, but Yugoslav students protested this meeting.
Yeah.
So this is the complex, the layered history of Yugoslavia, of not just the grand historical figures, but also everybody else, actually.
Exactly, yeah, very good, yeah. So thank you very much. And finally, yeah, we will have one of our own. So as Paul mentioned, Ivica Mladenovic from our institute has contributed a chapter, but unfortunately he's currently in Paris. So my colleague Jelena Vasiljevic, who is a senior research associate here at the institute, will be talking. And her academic background is in political anthropology and citizenship studies. And her expertise and research interests are theories of citizenship, citizenship transformations in post-Yugoslav states, memory politics, which we just touched upon as well, civic engagement, and social movements in Southeast Europe, and ideas and practices of solidarity. So I think you already see the connections.
Thank you, Stefan. Don't be deceived by these bio notes. I'm utterly incompetent for this subject matter. I'm completely an intruder here, but I don't mind it a bit. And I'm very thankful to Paul for inviting me to talk about this book. Really, I am totally incompetent for this subject matter, but I enjoyed the book. And my competence won't stop me from sharing my thoughts and comments on it. Let me start with this. What I loved about the book is that even though it's not intended to be a history of NAM, so it's not intended to be a history of a non-alignment movement, and it's explicitly, Paul explicitly said so in the introduction. But nevertheless, once you read it and once you go through all the chapters, you really feel like you actually read an comprehensive history of non-aligned movement, because you get familiar with so many historical details and you really think that, well, now you grasp it. So I think it's a very important, it will be a crucial read for not only for those who are interested in the non-alignment movement, it's an important, I would say, a piece of scholarly work for all those interested in the history of international relations and the history of the late 20th century, second half of the 20th century. So it's really important in that sense for a broader audience and interest. On the other hand, it really is a pastiche of different disciplinary takes, different disciplinary approaches. It tackles very, very different perspectives and topics. You have macro-historical accounts, micro-historical accounts, and then you realize also how, when you read the book, you realize how the account on non-alignment movement was so important. It's essentially important for understanding not only political and economic history of socialist Yugoslavia, but also social and cultural. It's an essential read also for all those interested in the social and cultural life of Yugoslavia. Even though at times my book really wants to decenter, to kind of go away from this Yugocentric perspective, it kind of shows you that you cannot really understand. Maybe what Paul says, maybe we need an account that is maybe more, or that is less Yugocentric. But on the other hand, if you want to have a comprehensive account of history of social Yugoslavia, you have to understand all these things and how inextricably intertwined the history of NAM was to different cultural and social aspects of Yugoslavia. Another thing that I found very fascinating is there's many contradictions that book tackles. So in his introduction, Paul mentions two central contradictions, but I think there are more to be found there. So Paul says in the introduction that, okay, the one crucial contradiction was that NAM was a project that sought to prefigure a post-national vision of a world. It seemed to go beyond nation states to do something internationally, although it was not only comprised of nation states and driven by nation state logic, but also it emerged within the context of what Tvrtko Jakovina calls obsession with national sovereignty, which is normal because all these states just recently got their sovereignties, right? It was a part of a decolonial struggle, and these nations just came to be sovereign after fighting against colonialism. So national sovereignty was so important, and yet they all tried together to form something that had at least as a vision post-national, or a world beyond sovereignty. The other contradiction was that, of course, the position of Yugoslavia, that was the global south was so important for the whole idea, yet of course Yugoslavia was not part of this global south. So how it negotiated its position within the idea of what global south is very, very important, and also it has it's contradictory in its own terms. But also there were some other contradictions with non-aligned movement, and they are very fascinating when you think about them. Non-alignment movement is all about this peaceful coexistence, and peaceful coexistence was very important also as a guiding principle of Yugoslav foreign policy, not only for now, but it was like one of these mantras that you can hear a lot: peaceful coexistence. And although non-alignment movement was also about anti-colonial struggle, it was about anti-fascism, it was about anti-racism, and so sometimes it's at odds with peaceful coexistence, right? And some more radical anti-colonialism was also ended by either deaths or brutal killings of leading revolutionaries of the time, like Che, but obviously Sukarno, right? Because the overthrow of the regime, and when Sukarno was overthrown, it wasn't just a regime change, it was a genocide, basically, that took place there. And as Paul said, then Yugoslavia came and said, okay, our arm deals are okay, right? So it's in a way what Paul names marginalization of radical alternatives. Yes, NAM in a way did that. It marginalized radical alternative while at the same time wanting to conceive a radical alternative. So it was an alternative vision of the world, and it's not. There are no straightforward answers. This is not a straightforward critique of NAM, of course. It's just a fascinating thing to think about, right? It's not just to criticize and to say, but they actually marginalize the real radical alternatives. It's just that there's this inherent contradiction that in trying to conceive of a radical alternative, in a way at the same time diminish some other more radical, maybe, alternatives. Another thing also that is very fascinating is the attempts of the Yugoslav leadership to be the agenda setters, and indeed they were the agenda setters. And that's really fascinating, especially if you think of it from our today's position, that we had leaders capable of setting the agenda in a global politics, and they were. The way they were steered, the whole project of non-alignment movement, and also the Yugoslav leadership were steered by this combination of values of idealism and pragmatism. Jakovina's chapter is all about that. He talks about how they were the guiding principles of NAM, but they would also say that they were the guiding principles of Yugoslav leadership, that this skillful combination of idealism and pragmatism, that idealism itself was a pragmatic way of thinking about the world. That it's really is fascinating to think about that. Now, when I read the book, I mostly thought about what NAM speaks to us today, not only in terms of its legacy or its many afterlives, but also in terms of its core and central notions, the notions that help build the NAM. What are they today? For instance, NAM was all about globalization otherwise, or modernization otherwise, and industrialization, right? Modernization and industrialization. So those words don't mean much today. Like, we don't want to be modern anymore. We don't even know what that means. And also to think about industrialization is, most post-socialist countries are heavily deindustrialized, and that is their major trauma. But also, on the other hand, industrialization today, in the shadow of an environmental crisis, we are kind of ambivalent about it. So all of a sudden, we can see now that two major topics, modernization, industrialization, mean very little today in less than 100 years. Also, what is the geopolitical situation of today? So non-alignment movement was it was an attempt to build something new, something alternative in a bipolar world. We don't live in a bipolar world anymore, but also we see the traces of bipolar world. We cannot really say that we're totally out of it. Can NAM legacy help us conceive an alternative in today's multipolar world? Can we use something from that legacy to conceive an alternative? And also, I quoted Jakovina's text before when I talked about it was the world that was obsessed with sovereignty. So what about today, the role of sovereignty in global international projects? We know when we witness today this new sovereignty turn, right, especially in EU, in Europe, but what does it really mean? And is it really important? In what ways? And can it inspire international connections? And finally, I just want to mention the chapter that at least spoke to me the most. That was the last chapter. But maybe because, I don't know, maybe because I'm an anthropologist and it was very, it has this ethnographic approach and the focus on lived experience. So it was about how experiences of non-alignment and kind of influence the way some people addressed and approached the refugee crisis in 2015 and 2016. Okay, I have to admit it's a very extended interpretation of the legacy of NAM. I have to admit that, but it's very interesting, this idea of how certain so it's about certain individuals who had in their families, they traveled to non-aligned countries and they spent some time there. They spoke the language. They were exposed to their cultures. And then when 2015 happened, when the Balkan route was opened, and then millions of migrants came through, these states, and they mostly came from non-aligned countries and from countries in which those people lived before. And then there was some people used this experience from their 80s, from 70s, and they were prompted to be in solidarity and to act and to react. And I loved these couple of ideas that were there in this chapter, the idea of solidarity as a geohistorical category, and also the notion of affective histories and how these affective histories resonate in contexts that come later. And this idea made me think about the various afterlives of non-alignment movement. And they also borrow the notion from Richard Williams' structures of feeling. So whether the structures of feeling of belonging and being exposed to various experiences thanks to NAM and how that affected our lives. And at the end, they talk about this potential role that historical experience can play in struggles for a more just and thoroughly decolonized world. So this potential, so there's nothing causal, there's nothing straightforward about it, but this potential that because we were exposed to certain experiences at one time can help us forge links to solidarity and can help us forge emancipatory forms of connecting with others in future. That kind of was very optimistic, and I liked the sound of it and the thought of it. And I will stop here. Thank you.
That was Yelena's allegedly uninformed and amateurish opinion. If there's one thing I disagree with her talk, it was that claim at the beginning, but otherwise...
If only Slavoj Žižek would start with, I'm totally incompetent.
Seems like you have something against Žižek, Paul. Yeah. I'd like to thank all three of you again. I very much enjoyed this, and I'm very eager to ask some questions, but I'm also even more eager to hear some from our audience, so I would like to first open the floor. Questions, comments?
And if you feel able to, please say who you are in case some of us don't know some of you.
All right, my name is Jelena Vesic, and I am art historian and visual art theorist. And yeah, I have two little, okay, I'm opening like two small polemical holes, to put it that way. The first is that somehow, okay, I have to say also this as a disclaimer, and this is something with which perhaps the most of you sitting around this table very much agree. Like I'm allergic totally to historical revisionism. And therefore, tracing like a little crunches of it in our conversations, which are I think like very friendly conversations. I adore the project, the book. I like the way that three of you have spoken about, or four of you have spoken about it today. But what I didn't like is that you were mentioning the term something like pooling histories out of oblivion, etc., which I think somehow dehistorizes actually not so long, but then also not so short history of dealing with a topic. History of dealing with the topic and the reasons of why the topic such as Yugoslavia, self-management, partisanship, non-alignment not have been erased, but why they came into focus at the beginning of 2000s. And I would say that the topic of non-alignment is in the intellectual sphere and in the public for actively very much for the last 13 years actually. Though this is the first like okay, the word comprehensive is not the best one, but the first academic project, but of course the interest in all these topics came not from academia, but from the like more wide Yugoslav scene, from the so-called independent scene, who started dealing after the wars with their own situation, and who tried to think this positive heritage from Yugoslav history in the present, for the sake of the present. So I think this is very important to somehow keep in mind in our all self-historicization, because we are so small that we are so small, and to put it in the terms of non-aligned, we are so small, but we do have politics, and we have to struggle for that politics and being kind of solidary among ourselves, and not to be always like in this role that I am the one who pulled the history out of oblivion. Okay, this is one thing. The second thing is what I can see in the book from as an art historian and as somebody who is dealing with images and with the arts. I mean, in general, I would say that the two contributions by the colleagues Bojana Videkanic and Mila Turajlić are actually very revisionist and very conservative and very apologetic, and we can polemize around that because I don't want to take much of time, but this is also a task perhaps for us art historians, people who are interested in moving images, cinema and so on, because I think that we need to really always, as the book does, approach as a whole. I mean, approach critically, non-apologetically, non-nostalgically, and polemically to the heritage of non-alignment. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take a few more questions if there are some, and then the panelists will answer several.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Abijah Ahern. I'm a Fulbright English teaching assistant at the University of Niš. So I just kind of stumbled upon this talk today because I was in Belgrade anyways. I guess my question, and the country's already come up a few times, Indonesia and Sukarno. I remember a few years into my undergrad, I was doing a project on non-alignment and specifically Yugoslavia's relationship with it. And at the same time, I was reading Vincent Bevan's The Jakarta Method, which is all about sort of the overthrow of Sukarno and the aftermath. And I remember doing those two things at the same time. I kept on, encountering all of these connections right there. And I think, especially in a lot of the literature I was encountering, it was so kind of focused on sort of the big three or whatever of Tito and Nehru and Nasser, and to a lesser extent Nkrumah and some others. But I always sort of found that I felt like the huge role of Indonesia, both in Bandung and in the whole early history of non-alignment, was, I felt like, surprisingly absent. So I guess my question is sort of like, how much does the book cover that, or sort of what are you guys' thoughts on sort of Indonesia-Yugoslav relationships in the context of now?
We do one more and then my mind can't do more than three.
Yeah, no, I think 3 is optimal. So if anybody else has got a question or a comment.
Yes, thank you. My name is Anna Sladovic. I would just like to connect these topics a little bit to our situation today, and to make a difference between positions, for example, in Zagreb and Belgrade, because we are aware of the approach of the government towards these topics in Serbia is very kind of well, let's say revisionistic, and also you can see a lot of interest of our government in topics of non-alignment in both museums, which are very much involved in these things. So you can actually see that the Museum of African Art was augmented to a national level at the end of the last year. So it is once again this kind of the museum, which was the city museum, is now of a national standing, you know. So the very topic of non-alignment is being brought very much in the front row, because the government is basically using this whole heritage for political purposes. So I would just say that there is a kind of a distinction between coming from Zagreb and coming from Belgrade in these terms. And the other, what I was wanting to do, to ask you a little bit about your topic on race and racism, because I would like to ask you, how do you make distinction between the term that you said, deracialized anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and color blindness? So if you can just a little bit elaborate on this. So thank you very much.
I think this is wonderful for the beginning of the discussion. So,
Shall I start? So Jelena, three things. You should write this up, because it would. I think it would immensely contribute to what the whole idea of the book was. Really, I almost wish we'd had this during the workshop, and there could have been an afterword. Right? Okay. Now, the second is that I did once appear in. Boyan was there. People paid to see me talk about the agonies of being an academic, right? And God knows why they paid, but people paid. But I started it by saying academics are very balanced people, because they have a whole heap of arrogance on one shoulder and a whole heap of insecurity on the other, right? And watching those two devils fight it out is really what basically happens. So I'm with you all the way on this. I'm with you all the way on this idea that we actually need a history of the ideas of the history of non-alignment that actually pays. And Neman, I think, partly tried to do that more than my introduction did, in a sense. Pays our debts to the people that made this possible, right? But this possible was always conceived, and it's actually why McGill Queens ended up being the publisher, and why people complain about the price, because Routledge, who we approached, saw this entirely as an academic book, didn't give a damn about picture quality, and, would have cost even more. De Gruyter, on the other hand, thought this was going to be a kind of, a book mainly of art historians and cultural people. So where am I going with this? I'm trying not to be defensive, because I'm not defensive on this. I think that it is actually very difficult to do something that tries to go beyond that distinction between academic work and cultural activism, right, in a way. And I think there's something else to be written about the importance of going beyond that, and that actually, yes, this would not have come back in without exactly that story that you tell. So I only want to kind of, as I go into retirement, and when I do finally die, I do want that whoever gives the eulogy to say Paul was never the one who pulled the hat out of oblivion, right? Because I always want to acknowledge the debts to the four sisters, four brothers, four mothers, and maybe in this introduction, and maybe even in this book, there isn't enough of that. So I think that's really important. We could talk about Boyana and Mila's chapters, because it is the disagreements that I might have with both of them that actually I think are really, really fruitful and really, really interesting. So I'll stop there, I think, with that. But really, please write this up, and please let's have a dialogue about this. Indonesia, I think, you do have that great man story. Or do you want to take? So you've got the kind of, Brioni is Nasser Nehru Tito, and Brioni nearly didn't happen. Nehru almost didn't come. He was only there for a very short period of time. He tried to play it down, and yet this was a really important part of performative Yugoslav politics, that there were 3 founding fathers. But then there became 5 founding fathers, right? Because you get the 3 of them joined by Nkrumah and Sukarno in the Yugoslav mission in September 1960 at the special session of the United Nations General Assembly. Now, of course, the Indonesian story gets complicated before the brutal overthrow of Sukarno because of Sukarno's attempt to do the Conference of New Emerging Forces. And very clearly, this was going to be a conference of states that had emerged from colonialism, and Sukarno was very clear that Yugoslavia would not be invited. So you already get the kind of, the kind of problems there. What they did have was the games of the new emerging forces, which Bojana and Georgia mention a little bit, and there's a lot more of it in Tvrtko Jakovina's biography of Budimir Lončar, because Lončar was Yugoslav ambassador to Indonesia. So you've got the souring of relationships with Indonesia and Yugoslavia quite quickly, and then yes, you've got the brutal right-wing coup. And actually, incredibly early, Yugoslavia becomes very instrumentalized in its approach to Indonesia. Dubravka Sekulic in the book on Energoprojekt talks about how in the 1980s, it was just about needing hard currency. The debt crisis happened so much that any project that could pay in dollars or petrodollars would be taken on, whereas earlier it wasn't like that. But Indonesia is an exception. There's an amazingly good group, some of you may know it better than me, there's a group of net artists in Indonesia that have this kind of web platform called From Bandung to Berlin, and it's basically like what would have happened if the Berlin Wall didn't fall, and what would have happened if there had been more Bandung conferences. All right? Now, we can talk about why there was no more Bandung conferences. It's the India-China thing, but they do it incredibly well in terms of kind of not revisionist history, I hope, Yelena, but kind of, counterfactual histories, and you can play little games online with it. So it's worth looking at. But one final point: there is some amazingly good stuff about Indonesian artists who came to Yugoslavia, who were part of art colonies, who produced really political art and stuff. So there's another thing to do with that. But yeah, you've got Eurocentrism, but you've also then got a kind of cherry picking of which nodes are important, whereas Indonesia was for many reasons incredibly important. That's Oh, the racism. Yeah. No, go on. Give me a bit of more.
Reading group. So let me just piggyback on the last one and tied to Yelena's question of revisionism. Well, I'm thinking about Mila's movie also, and multiple actually histories of the Algerian Revolution in Algeria itself, and Sadi Yatsef and his vision of Algerian Revolution. It's the question I have is revisionist for who? For whom? So basically, this is the next step that I think it's kind of a anti-author for revisionism is taking the voices of the global South more into consideration or in equal measure. This is what Paul was talking about in the beginning, because what we might consider in Mila's chapter here revisionist, I don't know how someone from Algeria would view it. It's a linked history, a connected history. This is something I would like to add to this discussion. And about the oblivion, well, I think we plentifully in this book, especially having Willits, that's one thing, someone who is constantly there, historian of non-alignment. But also the thing you said about non-alignment emerging and research about non-alignment emerging in the outer banks of non-academia. I don't think it's true, because you have publications of people who dealt with non-alignment in the 80s, such as Dragan Bogetic, who is an academic. He published a book about non-alignment even before Jakovina in 2006. So you have trends.
Yeah, the last 13 years.
Yeah, and to add to that, you have, as in other things, you have trends. So this is a part of a trend, I would say. And this is something that we just discussed, I think. We had a workshop in Vienna with some colleagues, and non-alignment, fetishizing non-alignment as such, I think, is also a bad thing, because you have, you mentioned Bandung, but there's a plethora of alternative networks, global networks. So this is something that's, I think, very important to take into notice. Anna's question and comment, I think I'm thinking about how each government in Serbia kind of rehashes, warms up this non-alignment in a microwave. In 2011 we had Jeremic, now we had Selakovic and Vucic. But also we can view it in 1989, the Yugoslav diplomatic corps struggled to get the conference to Belgrade. It was not Belgrade's turn. So every government is very pragmatic, which I think we show here, and we didn't shy away from this. I think the draw of non-alignment is gonna get bigger in this. I totally agree, and I would just add to this: the government is using, the current government in Serbia is using this precisely in a way we didn't want to use it in this book here anyway. We're with selective amnesia. So non-alignment, yes, but socialism, no. So non-alignment, no. How did Selakovic say it? Aid to the liberation movements, but not by whom? Not by Yugoslavia.
Yes.
Not Fanon, but Gorski Vienac. This is something he said at the event. I think it was the 100 years of the birth of Nelson Mandela. So this is something that struck me, how they are very selective in their amnesia. And this is also a trend. This was in 2018. I didn't catch the name. Baja, sorry. I think it's really interesting to look at the Indonesia-Yugoslavia relations. As Paul said, it's the historical epoch of the big man. But you have also the Yugoslav specific interest in Southeast Asia that I think my colleague Jovan Čavoški dealt with in the aid of Yugoslavia to Burma also, and the careful approach of Yugoslavia to Indonesia because of the outer ring of China. So it's a very complex political landscape there. And of course, it stands, as Paul said some time ago, and as Stefan noticed, the relations of Yugoslav government with this big man, it's not fraternal. However, it might seem it seems to be true later, even with Ben Bella, with Haile Selassie. It confirms actually what Jakovina is writing here, the utmost pragmatism of Yugoslav government in even its seemingly strongest ties of the big man, so like Tito Selassie or Tito Ben Bella. And I think this is very important in the case of Indonesia also. It's there's a Yugoslav diplomat in 1958 when the first one of the first coups in sub-Saharan Africa happened. He said, Ivo Sarečić, our politics should be tied to the people, not to the leaders. So this is something I noted to myself when I dealt with Africa, and this is something I think the Yugoslavs very much respected in the sense of the shifting tides of the global politics.
Can I do the race and racism just quickly? I mean, and this is going to sound as improvisational as it really is, except that there's one principle I didn't read out, which I've already written about and which should be coming out in Serbo-Croatian fairly soon, which is like the importance of holding together but not collapsing anti-fascism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and anti-imperialism. Like bringing them together but not conflating one with the other. And I kind of do that through a reading of Bandung, Havana, and Belgrade, actually, but very provisional. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and Nemanja talked about it, I think where I'm going is to decenter even the non-aligned movement itself. The work on the new international economic order is partly because what you get in the 70s is a revitalized non-aligned movement, because Yugoslavia find new interlocutors in Kenneth Kaunda and Julius Nyerere. So a new generation of African leaders who actually they want to do things and not just talk. And both of them talk to Tito about how the only thing that's been developed in the non-aligned movement is that every summit has more pages of communiques, right? So they want to do something, but they also have a view of the world as racially structured, right? And therefore, I think, G77 becomes incredibly important. I was even just in the Commonwealth archives where, Nyerere, Kaunda, and Malcolm Manley give the British government, even Harold Wilson, even before Thatcher, a really hard time around some of these things. So that's the second point. The third is that, of course, it has taken me, it will take me much longer than the 3 years since it came out to respond to that article by Jelena Subotic and Srđan Vukotic. Now, where do I start with that? I think it's an oversimplification, what they kind of argue. But I think what we need to think about is understandings of racial orderings and racial structurings. And therefore, race is not an identity, it's not a skin color, it is a social hierarchy. Of course, we all know that. We're kind of trying to think how non-aligned movement worked through some of that contradictory. Basically, it's another one of the really unresolved contradictions in a sense. And the deracialized anti-racism was really about, the condemnation of apartheid and the regime in Zimbabwe, but the reluctance to kind of go beyond that. Jeffrey Byrne cites the famous quote where, was it Ben Bella? Ben Bella says, black people are suffering, and Tito says, not just the black people, right? And you've got Kardelja, who Ivan Ivekovic told me. Kardelja had no idea which was Francophone Africa, which was Anglophone Africa, was very reluctant to actually, deal with Africa because Africa needed modernization before it could be an interlocutor. So, that's racism, in my view. And I think, we have to kind of think through some of that. So I'm hoping in the next year, actually, to finish that bit. And of course, coming back to Jelena, it is another issue that I think has been brought back onto the table from a lot of different places. The assemblage around trying to think about racism in relation to the North, West, East, and South has come onto the table in a lot of interesting ways. I just want to join the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paul. We are open for some more questions if anybody would. Or do you want to say something else? No. Having technical issues, so. Yeah. So, do we have any more questions? If I may briefly abuse my privilege of the moderator in that case, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention that might be of interest to many people. Is that aside from the fact that entire volumes of primary sources have been published by the Archive of Yugoslavia on Yugoslavia's various bilateral relations, they've also been digitized, so you can download these for free off the website. And perhaps, I don't know if somebody's looked into this, why this is so, but that could also, perhaps something would be said about the academic interest in diplomatic history, but also, why would money be given to digitize these specific publications of the archive as opposed to some others, and so on. And then another kind of impression of mine, obviously, most of the people who are in the volume, I know them personally, and I've spent time with them at conferences, just like with Nemanja and Paul, and this is kind of already a critical mass of academics working on socialist Yugoslavia and the non-aligned movement. But, I've never at these encounters met Indian academics or Ghanaian academics, and I wonder, is there now somebody sitting in Ghana doing, Ghana and the non-aligned movement, and why haven't we yet reached the point where all of these people are meeting? Right? Why is there no academic non-alignment in a way of meeting together and discussing these issues? So I think this is, one of this is definitely not something that I think the publication is blind to, but something that it poses as the logical next step, I'd say.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in terms of, I guess, what would be more of a specific question rather than a comment, there would be two. One is kind of intentionally easy in the sense that it's what everybody would think of immediately, but I think, this is probably something that will be written about a century from now. It is called the non-aligned movement, but is it about non-alignment? Is it about socialism? Is it about anti-colonialism? And in a way, it's about all three, but it's also sometimes not about all three, as pragmatic politics get in the way. So I think a lot would really be said about that. I really think volumes could be written on, and there are, again, plenty of arguments for or against for all of these. And the other question would be specific to Yugoslavia, which is, if you could elaborate more about kind of Yugoslavia's economic relationship to these countries, because we will have, starting from next Tuesday, actually, a series of 6 lectures called Yugoslavia in the World System, essentially dealing with the world systems framework of Emanuel Wallerstein, and the idea also of uneven combined development, of dependency, and so on. And one of our colleagues who will be discussing this, Rade Pantic, is very much insistent also on the idea that in the 1960s, Yugoslavia essentially engages in sub-imperialism with some of these countries, so that it's trying to kind of rectify its own position of unequal exchange by engaging in similar relations with other developing countries. So I think that a lot could be said about that, and I'd like to hear some about that from you. And by no means do not consider this the only questions. Definitely, if somebody else would like to ask something, please go ahead.
That was already 4.
The first 2 were more comments, I guess, right? So, but
we'll reply shortly.
so I guess I did abuse my privilege completely.
I think non-alignment, in 100 years, socialism, anti-colonialism, sure, it could be, there could be spaces in libraries for volumes on this terminology, but I think, and this also applies to African actors, intentionally ambivalent use of this is present in, we all testified to it in Yugoslav cases. But to tie into your precise question on scholars in the Global South now working on this basically you weren't there, but you guessed our last Friday's meeting in Vienna. Yeah, so we were discussing how to engage with these scholars, but there's a couple of problems, of course, there. In the case of Ghana, you mentioned it, so I'll be free to take it as a case study. You have scholars in Ghana, historians and other social scientists, and if you read Ghanaian historiography, you have already from the 1960s the decline of the mythology of non-alignment. So it's in a really short span. If you see Yugoslavia non-alignment in the 1960s constantly mentioned in the Ghanaian context, later you don't have it. For example, my colleague Radina Vucetic, who was on a research trip in Ghana, she said even Tito's image was removed from Nkrumah's mausoleum, and the curator didn't know exactly why. So not to go into, of course, this kind of discussion of what's going on there. There are people in Egypt, in Algeria, who work on these things, but I think their approaches are not necessarily complementary to ours, but they are different. They are from these different connections. You mentioned anti-colonialism. I do think this is a wider net that was cast then, and that's actually actual now, and being that that's my current project, this Mediterranean anti-colonial networks, this is actually something that I see here as a predecessor of non-aligned institutional networks, and something that's much, much stronger than some non-aligned connections. And this is, I think, worth mentioning, because the traditions, the historical and social scientific traditions in these countries prompt researchers in these areas. For example, Algeria is a good example. Local historians are familiar with some of Yugoslav's roles in Algeria, as we've recently seen in the case of the exhibition of the Museum of African Art, which Paul and Anna mentioned. And this is prompted from anti-colonialism, not from non-aligned. And I may have something more, but after Paul.
So let me go in reverse order. So when we had the launch in the Economic Institute, I reminded people that I was very grateful to the Institute of Economics for employing a foreign sociologist, because there was no way that the institutes of social science that had been captured by very right-wing historians and social scientists would employ me, but there were enough leftists in the Institute of Economics. But they thought they were getting a practical sociologist, and I said I want a job so I can reread Foucault. But isn't it ironic that actually now, in my last year or a year and a half, I think I'm finally turning to economic questions, and I do think the new international economic order, I do think world systems theory, and I do think Prebish's core periphery kind of commodity argument that the periphery can never actually become integrated. Well, he wouldn't use the word capitalism, but into global economics, right? Wallerstein and Samir Amin were beautifully critical of the new international economic order, partly because it was about the incorporation of bourgeoisies in the global south into a global capitalist system, but that becomes really, really quite important. And of course, before every summit, there is a document commissioned to look at Yugoslavia's trading relations with different parts of the world. And they find every time that actually the global south increases in importance, but remains relatively limited compared to the West and Comic-Con, whatever it was called, the economic version of Comic-Con. And they were also conscious that it was this kind of, it classically fit into dependency theory, because it was about taking raw materials, moving them into semi-industrial and then exporting them on, and so on and so forth, right? So there was an understanding that there might be a problem with that, I think, very different from, remember that account of the meeting of Tito and Stalin, where Tito wants to talk about the possibility of, they didn't call it self-management, but, kind of workers' democracy and small collectives. And Stalin opens his notebook and says to Tito, so you have aluminium, right? You have copper, right? So he's making a colonial list of extractivist things that he can do, right? So that becomes incredibly important. I entirely agree with Nemanja that I think you can find a less asymmetric network of people working around these questions, but you have to phrase it a little differently from the way in which this book is phrased, in a sense. You have to kind of decenter non-alignment, or kind of bring it more into a dialogue with Bandung, I think, to start with. You certainly have to bring artists and cultural production in, because I think cultural exchange, those dialogues are there in a way that they're not so much in academia. But the third bit of work, which I think is really, really interesting, and Nemanja is doing that with some people, is to kind of think about certain urban centers as hubs of kind of, people meeting together. So just as when you're doing stuff on before the Second World War, Paris or Vienna becomes a hub of future intellectual global south, or Brussels, the famous speech by Sukarno in Bandung saying, I recognize you all, we had to meet in Brussels in 1927, but now we can meet here. There are still these issues of networking and hubs, and maybe Belgrade, given students that came, was one of those. The final bit of the dialogue, you know, one of the best books I've read for the last few years is Lucas Stanek's book on architecture in Ghana and East Africa. And the point there is, of course, Yugoslavia was never alone. You know, there were architects from East Germany, and sometimes they were competing with each other, but sometimes they were working together. So I do think that this kind of, you know, this division between those who were studying Soviet involvement in the Global South and those studying Yugoslav involvement in the Global South, we have to actually kind of think together. We just made a joke that the reason the archives are digitalized in that way is because an embassy, say the Indian embassy, gives some money, and then they do a history of Yugoslav-Indian relations. To come back to Anna's thing, of course, this selective kind of, you know, use of upgrading institutions, you know, when it suits. But, you know, 3 years ago, this place was being, the independence of this place was under attack, right? So, you know, that kind of how to retain independence, but also continue in existence seems to me to be incredibly important. And, you know, Igor's here, so we had this long discussion about the incomparability of Serbia and Croatia when we were together in Ljubljana. And of course, if they're incomparable, that means they're comparable. Actually, I never managed to say that to you then.
So, do we have some more questions or comments? Yeah. If there are no more questions or comments, I would like to once again thank you all for coming. I would like to thank our panelists for the and to conclude, I would like to say that we are going for some drinks now, and everybody who wants to join is more than welcome.